For 20 years I was a masterpiece of his creation, a living sculpture he titled The Perfect Wife. I was beautiful but not distractingly so. I was intelligent, but I never brandished it in a way that might challenge him. I was the silent, graceful hostess, the serene presence at his side, my opinions as muted as the tasteful beige tones of our palatial home. He moved through the world like a storm, a whirlwind of ambition and power, and my role was to be the calm, elegant eye of that storm, the quiet center that made his chaos look like command. He was a man who collected beautiful, expensive things, and I was his most prized acquisition. He never saw me as a partner, he saw me as a testament to his success, the final, perfect accessory to a life of ruthless acquisition. He had no idea that while he was busy collecting power, I was collecting information. I was the ghost at his dinner parties, my smile a perfect mask as I refilled the wine glasses of politicians and predatory CEOs. While they saw a deferential wife, I was a silent intelligence operative, listening to the boasts, the thinly veiled threats, the casual discussion of lives and companies being dismantled for their profit. I learned the language of his world not in a boardroom, but from the periphery, the place where no one ever looks. I learned about leverage, about hostile takeovers, about shell corporations and offshore accounts. He would come home, energized from a corporate kill, and explain his victories to me in condescendingly simple terms, as one might explain a complex game to a small child. He thought he was impressing me with his brilliance. He was, in fact, giving me a masterclass in his own destruction. He taught me that loyalty was a commodity to be bought and sold. He taught me that everyone has a secret, a weakness, a price. He taught me that the most effective attacks are the ones the enemy never sees coming. He was so blinded by his own ego, so convinced of my ornamental purpose that he never once considered that I was listening, truly listening, and that I was a far better student than he could ever imagine. He left his laptop open, his confidential papers strewn across his desk, as secure in my disinterest as he was in the rising of the sun. I would dust his desk, my eyes scanning encrypted spreadsheets, absorbing names, figures, and connections. I developed a photographic memory for the architecture of his corruption. It was a game at first, a way to occupy a mind that was slowly atrophying in a gilded cage. I would piece together the puzzles, connecting the dots between a whispered phone call and a sudden resignation in the government, between a secret meeting on his yacht and the collapse of a rival company. I saw the web he was spinning, intricate and dark, and for years I did nothing. I was a passive observer, a morally numb archivist of my husband's sins. I had made my bargain, his world for my silence. The bargain broke on a rainy Tuesday in March. He had been on the phone all day, a low, angry growl in his voice. He was closing a deal one he had been working on for months. It was a real estate development, his biggest yet, a new luxury complex on the city's waterfront. He called it his legacy project. I was in the library arranging flowers when I heard him talking to his lawyer through the half-open study door. He was laughing, a sound that I had once found charming but now recognized as the sound of a predator enjoying the kill. He was talking about the final obstacle, a small, state-funded hospice for the terminally ill that sat on the last parcel of land he needed. The city had refused to sell, citing the vulnerability of the patients. My husband had, in his words, solved the problem. He had manufactured a health and safety crisis. He had bribed a low-level inspector to falsify a report about asbestos and structural instability. The report was a lie, a complete fabrication, but it was enough. The city, faced with a public scandal and the astronomical cost of a fabricated renovation, had buckled. The hospice was being closed, its patients dispersed with little notice to already overcrowded facilities across the state. He laughed again as he said it. Laughed. I felt the blood drain from my face. My mother had spent her last days in a hospice just like that one. I knew the quiet dignity they afforded people in their final moments, the kindness of the nurses, the small measure of peace it gave to families. He was taking that away, destroying that sanctuary not out of necessity but for profit, for one more jewel in his crown. He wasn't just a ruthless businessman, he was a ghoul, feasting on the vulnerability of the dying. In that moment, the sculpture of the perfect wife cracked. The 20 years of silent complicity, of looking away, of telling myself that his world was not my world, it all came crashing down. I looked at the man in the study, this stranger I had shared a bed with for 2 decades, and I felt no love, no loyalty, only a cold, crystalline hatred that was as pure and as hard as a diamond. He had built an empire on the ruins of other people's lives. I would build my freedom on the ruins of his. He hung up the phone, a triumphant smirk on his face. He walked into the library and kissed me, his lips tasting of expensive scotch and moral decay. He told me we were celebrating tonight. He had no idea what we were truly marking. It was not the birth of his legacy. It was the beginning of his end, and the architect of his downfall was the one person in the world he never, ever would have suspected. His perfect, silent wife was about to find her voice, and it would be a whisper that would bring his entire world crashing down. My transformation began in the one place he never looked, the household accounts. For years, he had given me a ludicrously generous allowance, a sum meant to keep me placated with designer clothes and charity luncheons. He never checked the statements, considering it beneath him. It was my play money, now it became my war chest. The first thing I purchased was not a diamond bracelet, but the most sophisticated, untraceable VPN service I could find and a series of encrypted burner phones. I became a ghost in the digital world, a phantom with no name and no history. My movements online were a labyrinth of bounced signals and false identities. I operated from the guest bedroom, a room decorated in his mother's oppressive taste that he hadn't set foot in for years. It became my command center. My first target was his pride. I knew from his rants that there was a young, tenacious financial journalist at a major newspaper who had been a thorn in his side for years. My husband despised him, seeing him as an idealistic nuisance. I saw him as my first surgical instrument. I created an anonymous email address, the kind that vanishes after one use, and sent a single, cryptic message. It contained a document, a minor shipping manifest I had photographed from a file on his desk months ago. On its own, it was meaningless. But I included a note. Look at the import duties paid on container 7B, then cross-reference the registered weight with the bill of lading for the subsidiary in the Cayman Islands. It was a small discrepancy, a minor bit of tax evasion amounting to a few $100,000, pocket change for my husband, but it was a thread. I knew this journalist was the kind of man who would pull on a thread until the entire tapestry unraveled. And I knew my husband's arrogance would make him underestimate the threat until it was too late. While that small seed of doubt was being planted in the press, I moved on to my second target, his inner circle. I had watched these men for years. I knew their vanities, their insecurities, their secret resentments. His second-in-command was a man consumed by a gambling addiction, a secret my husband knew and used as a leash. His chief financial officer was a deeply paranoid man who trusted no one. I decided to introduce them to each other's demons. Using another burner phone and a voice-altering app, I made a call to the CFO. I didn't introduce myself, I just said, "Your partner's debts in Vegas are getting dangerous. He's skimming from the new development project to cover his losses. Check the preliminary invoices for the concrete supplier. The numbers are inflated." They weren't, of course, not yet, but the suggestion was enough. I knew the CFO's paranoia would do the rest. He would start scrutinizing everything, creating friction, demanding answers his partner couldn't give. Next, I sent a series of anonymous text messages to the gambler's bookie, a notoriously violent man whose name I had overheard my husband mention once. The messages hinted that a huge windfall was coming his debtor's way from a side deal on the waterfront project, and that he should start applying pressure to get his money. I was pitting their own weaknesses against each other, creating a storm of suspicion and fear within the fortress of his company. All the while, my performance as the perfect wife reached its zenith. As my husband began to feel the first tremors of unease, a nosy journalist asking pointed questions, his top two executives suddenly at each other's throats, I became his sanctuary. I would listen to his furious tirades about incompetence and betrayal, my face a mask of loving concern. I would rub his shoulders, murmuring soothing words, telling him he was brilliant and that he would overcome this, just as he always did. He would look at me with such gratitude, telling me I was the only person in the world he could trust. The irony was so thick I could taste it. He was confessing his fears to his executioner, seeking comfort from the very source of his pain. He had no idea that as he slept, I was in the guest room, orchestrating the next phase of his demise. The final piece of this stage of the plan involved the hospice, the sin that had started it all. I used my anonymous identity to create a charitable foundation online. I funded it with a significant, untraceable donation from my play money, routing it through a dozen offshore accounts. The foundation's stated purpose was to provide legal aid to victims of corporate real estate malfeasance. Then, I sent a package to the recently fired director of the hospice. It contained the falsified inspector's report, which I had copied from my husband's files, alongside a detailed breakdown of his development company's projected profits. And finally, it contained a card with the website for my new foundation and a simple, anonymous note: "There are people who can help you fight back. You are not alone." I was not just dismantling his empire, I was empowering his victims. I was using his own money to fuel the resistance against him. He thought he was building a legacy of concrete and steel. I was ensuring his true legacy would be one of disgrace. The journalist's article was published a month later. It was a small piece buried in the business section, but the headline was a dagger: "Questions raised over import practices at waterfront development." My husband laughed it off, calling it a desperate smear tactic, but I saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. The first crack in his armor had appeared. He had no idea that I was already sharpening the knives to exploit it. The small article was not a bombshell but a fuse. It didn't bring him down, but it created smoke, and where there is smoke, other people start looking for fire. The initial piece prompted a low-level inquiry from the Customs Department, a bureaucratic headache my husband was used to swatting away. But at the same time, the class-action lawsuit from the hospice patients, now fully funded by my anonymous foundation and represented by a team of hungry young lawyers, hit the front pages of the local news. Suddenly, his legacy project wasn't a symbol of urban renewal, it was a story of a heartless corporation evicting the dying. The public narrative began to turn against him. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment to escalate. His empire was built on a complex network of shell corporations and interlocking directorships, designed to hide ownership and liability. It was a web I had spent years mapping out in my mind. He had once mockingly called it his financial fortress. He didn't know I had stolen the blueprints. I chose my next target carefully, a mid-level investment bank that handled the financing for many of his projects. They were a reputable firm, highly sensitive to any hint of scandal. Using a new digital identity, I posed as a disgruntled junior executive from my husband's company. I compiled a dossier of evidence, combining verifiable truths with carefully crafted near-truths. I included documents proving the tax evasion from the first leak, but I also included fabricated emails suggesting a widespread conspiracy to defraud investors on the waterfront project, cleverly implicating his paranoid CFO. I sent the package not to the authorities but to the bank's chief compliance officer, a notoriously risk-averse man whose career depended on maintaining the bank's pristine reputation. The effect was immediate. The bank, fearing regulatory scrutiny and public scandal, announced it was launching an internal review and in the interim freezing all credit lines to my husband's companies. The financial juggernaut ground to a halt overnight. The news sent shockwaves through the investment community. My husband was apoplectic. He was trapped. He couldn't access his capital, his partners were at war with each other, and the media was painting him as a villain. He became a caged lion, roaring at everyone, his legendary control completely shattered, and through it all I was his rock. I listened to his frantic, paranoid theories. He blamed the journalist, he blamed his CFO, he blamed his rivals. The list of suspects was long, but my name was never on it. I was the one person who was above suspicion, the loyal wife, the only one he could trust. He would collapse into my arms at night, this powerful man reduced to a trembling, terrified shell, and confess his deepest fears, all while I mentally took notes, planning my next move. The final blow had to be the one that was not just professional but personal. I had saved the most damning piece of evidence for last. Years ago, he had been involved in a backroom deal to secure a zoning variance from a city councilman. The councilman had a secret, a gambling problem, and a mistress, and my husband had exploited it ruthlessly. He hadn't just bribed him, he had set him up, recording his indiscretions to use as blackmail. My husband kept a copy of that recording in a hidden safe in his study, a trophy of his own cleverness. I had known about it for years. With him distracted and unraveling, it was shockingly easy to access the safe. I made a copy of the recording and sent it not to the press but to the councilman's wife, a proud, influential woman from a powerful political family. The fallout was nuclear. The wife immediately filed for a messy, public divorce, and the councilman, facing personal and political ruin, confessed everything to the district attorney in exchange for a plea deal. The subsequent investigation into my husband was no longer about white-collar financial crimes, it was about blackmail, extortion, and corruption of a public official. Federal agents arrived at our home at dawn. I watched from the upstairs window as they led him away in handcuffs, his face a mask of utter disbelief. The storm had finally broken, and he was at its center. I played the part of the devastated wife for the cameras, a picture of quiet, tragic dignity. The world saw a woman whose life had been destroyed by the secret sins of her husband. They showered me with sympathy. In the end, he lost everything. His companies were dismantled by regulators and creditors. His associates, to save themselves, testified against him. He was sentenced to a decade in federal prison. I visited him once just before he was transferred. He sat opposite me, a broken man in an orange jumpsuit, the ghost of the titan he once was. He looked at me, his eyes searching for an answer. "Who was it?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Who did this to me?" I didn't say a word. I simply reached into my purse and placed a small object on the table between us. It was a single, pressed flower, a common garden marigold. It was the same type of flower that had grown in the window boxes of the hospice he had destroyed. I watched his eyes as he looked at the flower, then back at my calm, unreadable face, and in that moment he knew. The color drained from his face as the impossible, unthinkable truth dawned on him. It wasn't his rivals, it wasn't his enemies. It was the quiet, decorative object he had kept by his side for 20 years. I stood up, turned, and walked away without looking back, leaving him alone with the flower and the ruins of the world he had built. I had my freedom. Thanks listening this story. Now I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear right now. Share this story with your friends and don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to Revenge Laura for more episodes.